Osiris.
Coming at you May 3rd, 2024. It's the inaugural record release from Discograffiti. Metal Machine Muzak is a slanted tribute to Lou Reed's divisive 1975 double LP Metal Machine Muzak. Lester Bangs called it the greatest album ever made, but no matter how it hits you, it's always been the ultimate music freak secret handshake. My ambient reimagining features 4 16-minute 1-second tracks, just like the original, and each one was created by a top-shelf indie rock visionary. Lou BARLOW from Dinosaur Jr. and Sebadoh, CORY HANSON from Wand, CULLEN HART from the Olivia Tremor Control, and Mark Robinson from Unrest. That's right, not a slouch in the bunch, unlike 99% of the compilations you've ever begrudgingly purchased for the one and only band on it you just had to hear. Metal Machine Muzak won't be available on streaming. The digital drops on May 3rd. The vinyl will be shipped this summer, and we're taking pre-orders for both right now. The LPs are going fast. They're being produced in a very limited edition run of 300 numbered 180-gram color vinyl double LP gatefold copies, only 100 of which can be ordered online. These copies will be numbered from 1 to 100, and they're first come, first served. To order, just go to patreon.com/discograffiti, then head into our shop. Again, that's patreon.com/discograffiti. Don't miss out on Metal Machine Muzak, the ambient experience designed to make Brian Eno run screaming.
I took Metal Machine Muzak partly as a way into an altered state, but also in the way that I use a flicker device called a mind machine. It uses binaural beats, and it works on your brain waves, your alpha waves through to your theta waves. And that's initially scary. The first 10 seconds of hearing binaural beats through headphones, having these glasses where bright lights are flickering at you, you want to take it off instantly. But if you stick with it, you go into very deep altered states. And that informed the way that I use Metal Machine Muzak, which is to go into an altered state.
Welcome to Discograffiti, the Music Obsessives podcast that gives freaks like you and me the chance to connect with a brotherhood obsessed with rating the entire discography of every single artist and band that ever mattered. I'm your host, Dave Gebroe, and with 3 to 4 episodes each week, you're going to gain a comprehensive knowledge of an act's history and output in the time it takes to listen to one album. Each new guest swings a hard left into an area you either had no idea you needed to know about or know all about and can't believe you're not alone out there. I am thrilled to announce that we have partnered with the podcast network Osiris Media, the leading storyteller in music. You can check out all their music podcasts at osirispod.com. And in this episode, we'll be turning our spray cans on Lou Reed's deafeningly assaultive 1975 double album, Metal Machine Muzak, along with our special guest, author David Holzer, who's currently hard at work on a book about the record. In this episode, David and I discuss the manifold ways in which Metal Machine Muzak can be used as a weapon, why having a propensity for substance abuse lends itself to having the skill set one may require to fully immerse within the depths of Lou's work, and the fucking sonic seagulls. To order Metal Machine Muzak, just head over to patreon.com/discograffiti/shop, or just click either of the links right there in the show notes. But whatever you do, make sure you order it, because it'll blow your effing mind, and it's for a good cause, because it'll help keep this show afloat. Just try to imagine a world without Discograffiti. Yeah, I know, it stinks. And while you're up there ordering on Discograffiti's Patreon, feel free to subscribe as well for the complete versions of all our shows, plus a massive barrage of over 150 extra episodes. Even if you're on the fence, you might as well, because it's completely free to become a basic member. And away we go then. Our guest this evening is a writer whose area of fascination and expertise lay in the intersection between music, the counterculture, and esoteric practices. In other words, my kind of guy. He's written extensively on the Beat Generation writers, particularly my pal William Burroughs, and his work's been published by the highly respected Beat Scene magazine. Apart from reviews of Lou Reed albums and books about him, he is the author of Chasing the White Light, Lou Reed, the Telepathic Secretary, and Metal Machine Music for Ugly Things magazine. After he shared that piece with Laurie Anderson, he was then quoted in the liner notes for the reissue of Lou's Hudson River Wind Meditations album, the record that, in conjunction with Metal Machine Music, actually provided the foundational inspiration for Discograffiti's brand new tribute album, Metal Machine Muzak, and thus the serpent eats its own tail. To cut to the quick, he's currently hard at work on a book about Lou Reed's Metal Machine Music, and so it's absolutely no surprise whatsoever that he's here with us today, seeing as these days, Discograffiti's got layers upon layers of feedback on the subject, as it were. Would you please offer up a deafeningly assaultive and divisive, hey, how you doing, to a man who's on a valiant mission to catch a severe case of tinnitus, whether intentionally or not, David Holzer.
That's a fantastic intro, Dave. Thanks very much. I hope I live up to it.
My favorite thing about my intros is it makes everyone feel more and more fearful the longer I go.
Well, I feel like I could go 15 rounds of talking and gibbering about Metal Machine Music and Lou in general. So you pumped me up, Dave.
And by the way, when I say my pal, William Burroughs, what I mean by that is in September 1993, I went to his house and knocked on his door in Lawrence, Kansas. And he came to the door. I woke him up and he said, you know, I was sleeping, please come back tomorrow. And I hung out with him for an afternoon, tape recorded the entire thing without even asking him because I was a petulant son of a bitch, and had an unbelievable, unforgettable time.
That is great. I never met him. The only one of the great beat triumvirate that I met was Allen Ginsberg. But Burroughs is utterly fascinating. And you know, I've written about his book, The Ticket That Exploded. And when you study his work very closely, you realize any idea that things like the cut up were random is just utter rubbish. I mean, the man worked and worked.
I mean, his ideas, along with Byron Geisen, are so endlessly inspirational to me because, you know, the concepts just feed on themselves. And the idea that if you cut word lines, that the future leaks out has given rise in my life. You know, I mean, I look back, you know, in my early 20s, I used to play games with a friend of mine. We would just pull random letters out of a pot of alphabet soup and see what they spelled. We would come up with word games that were based on these concepts, and it really gave rise to the first major primary phase of my creative life.
That's fantastic. I mean, I've never been able to harness the power of cut-ups in that way, but I'm more interested in, as an example, Burroughs as a kind of forensically accurate writer. For me, the Yahé letters and Queer are among the best things Burroughs ever wrote, which of course are not cut up, are very descriptive, very, very straightforward. And it's interesting, I interviewed a guy who organized the summit meeting between Bowie and Burroughs, which was published in Rolling Stone in 73, I think it was. Craig Kopitas, his name was.
Ziggy Stardust was basically written with the cut-up technique.
That's right. And this guy, Craig Kopitas, was actually a pal of Burroughs's for a while. And he said Burroughs taught him more about being a journalist than anybody else did. And that's kind of really interesting, isn't it? When you think about Burroughs, the experimental writer, the guy who kind of believed in every kind of magical theory, who took Scientology seriously and genuinely did, who believed in magic and all that kind of stuff, but was an influence to a real hard-boiled journalist. That gives you a sense of the breadth of Burroughs as a writer.
And I think one link between what we're truly here to talk about and Burroughs' later work is that the intended effect of books post-Junkie, post-Yahé letters, and all the early stuff, is that the idea is not the work itself, it's the effect produced by the work. And it's the same thing with Metal Machine Music and Burroughs' later work, is that the idea is it'll open a time hole. It's kind of like, I remember when I was 20, my friends and I would, in order to poke at the idea of the alternate worlds theory of quantum mechanics, we would do things that were outside of the norm in order to dart into an alternate reality, hopefully. So I remember my friend Brett bathed in a bathtub filled with pasta. And then later that night, we were super perceptive about how weird everything was because we thought maybe we had entered an alternate reality that was opened up by that. And it was really about the effect produced by this thing. Because a lot of people don't listen to Metal Machine music or even consider it without just considering its effects. Most people haven't even heard it. They've only heard of it. So tell me, do you remember how you first came across Metal Machine music?
Yeah, I was a teenage Lou Reed fan from about the age of 11 or 12, simply because growing up in England in the early 70s, we all read the New Musical Express, and there were 2 or 3 ultra-hip journalists who made it a point of referencing these countercultural types. And David Bowie was interviewed very regularly. And Bowie was always talking about Lou Reed, always talking about the Velvet Underground. And of course, he produced Transformer, which came out in 72. Walk on the Wild Side. I remember seeing the video for Walk on the Wild Side at the TV show that we all watched called Top of the Pops, which basically played what was in the charts. So you got everything from hard rock to disco to reggae to soul to whatever. And seeing the video for Walk on the Wild Side and wondering what on earth it was. It's a piece of film of Lou in concert with that kind of white Phantom of Rock makeup and the leathers on. And then hearing the Velvet Underground at 3 o'clock in the morning on a pirate radio station that broadcast from the North Sea off the coast of England, very near where I grew up, and being absolutely petrified by Waiting for the Man, because it doesn't stop. It doesn't swing. It doesn't boogie. And everything else I'd been listening to up until that point had been derived from the blues. And Walk on the Wild Side was just this staccato beat, and Lou intoning over the top of it. And then I felt I had to seek out the Velvet Underground at the same time as really buying from then on in every single one of Lou's solo records. But when I got to Metal Machine Muzak, I looked at the cover, and I remember reading My Week Beats Your Year, which I think was just the coolest thing I'd ever read in my life at the age of 14, which is what I was when Metal Machine Muzak came out. But I steered clear of it. I think maybe because I'd read these damning reviews of it in the British music press, these very smart-ass, snide reviews about the album, and just didn't buy it. And it kind of threw this status in my mind as this thing that it was going to be a very big deal to listen to for years and years. And actually, it was only really a couple of years ago, and this is probably heresy, that I could listen to it streamed on Spotify and not feel that I was entering into a world, as you talked about Burroughs, of it sort of getting its tentacles into me, that I could dip my toe in the water. But then I got obsessed, and I started listening to it at least one section every day, as loud as I could stand it, for pretty much the past 2 years. And I had an artificial heart valve fitted when I was 60, which was coming up for 3 years ago. And I started getting really interested in the idea of being a cybernaut, of being a cyborg, and what it means to be kept alive by something metallic. And I started then kind of musing on the title, Metal Machine Muzak, and what Lou was trying to do, or what I thought he might be trying to do, and disappearing into this album, which as an artifact, you could ponder forever. Like, why is it called Metal Machine Muzak? Why does it look the way it does? Why does it sound the way it does? How is it made? And then what effect does it have on you? And I think you're absolutely right in what you were talking about in relation to Burroughs. I mean, Burroughs wrote, as he famously said, he didn't write to reflect reality. He wrote to change reality. And I would suggest that Metal Machine Muzak was made to change the listener.
Oh, without a doubt. In my experience with it, I have to be careful when I listen to it because I'm prone to depression. My musical empathy is such that, it really affects me. I'm not just putting something on just to listen to it. I'm allowing it to seep into my pores. So when I first started listening to it, it really was a result of reading Lester Bang's writings. I hadn't heard it. I read the article, The Greatest Album Ever Made. I read his incredible interviews with Lou, which to me is the apotheosis of all music journalism. At first, I think I wasn't able to utilize the double record except as, something to produce a result. So I would pull up to red lights with my window down and have it blasting without turning and looking at the neighboring driver. There was a neighbor that I hated, and every time I would leave, I would turn it up louder and louder, and he eventually moved out. I would use it to produce effects, but not in myself. And oddly, and maybe aptly as well, the 4 participants in Metal Machine Muzak, actually, I think 2 of the 4 of them use it to relax. So I think it's got a very nebulous Rorschach test kind of a vibe to it. I don't think it's necessarily a nightmarish thing, as you've seen, as nightmarish as people have made it out to be.
No, I would agree with you. I think, and you saying that brings to mind, the famous story about Burroughs being treated disrespectfully in a cafe in Soho in London, I think the Mocha Cafe, and making a tape recording of, I think, riots and hysterical noises and things like that. And standing across from the cafe, I think sometime in the late 60s, early 70s, with his trench coat, his fedora, and his portable tape recorder, playing these sounds of unrest and anguish, I suppose. And he was absolutely convinced he was responsible for closing the Mocha Cafe down, which is kind of wonderful and ridiculous in equal measure. But I know quite a few people that have used Metal Machine Muzak in the way that you say, as a weapon. I was in a record shop in the UK just after Christmas and looking for vinyl copies of Metal Machine Muzak, which, as you know, pretty hard to find nowadays, and asking the grizzled old record shop guy, do you have Metal Machine Muzak? And him reminiscing fondly about how just before he was closing and he wanted people to leave and stop crate digging, he would put on Metal Machine Muzak very loudly and they would leave. But for me, and this is something that absolutely fascinates me, and in the kind of intersection that you described, my interest in esoteric practices and my interest in Brian Geison's Dream Machine. Have you used the Dream Machine?
I have.
And so I would say that Metal Machine Muzak, its intention is partly that of the Dream Machine, to disrupt rational thought. And the same as the cut-up, which is to create that kind of mental space where anything can leak in. As you say, the future could leak in, whatever. And I use Metal Machine Muzak for that purpose, like 2 of your collaborators in Metal Machine Muzak, because it's unnervingly like using flicker. It's unnervingly like what happens to you when you go into a deep relaxation or a deep meditation after yoga. You drift into it. And I see things when I listen to Metal Machine Muzak in that way. And my fiance, who didn't really know who Lou Reed was until she got involved with me, I asked her to listen to Metal Machine Muzak in the same way. And I recorded myself describing what I saw, and I recorded her describing what she saw. And it was really similar. It was absolutely fascinating. There's a Pitchfork review of Metal Machine Muzak by a guy called, I think, Mark Robinson. He describes hearing seagull-type noises, bird noises, and that's what I hear, and that's what my partner heard as well. And we both saw pulsing lights in the way that you do when you go into a deep meditation. So this is the great irony of Metal Machine Muzak. It can be a weapon, or it can be a relaxation aid. And I'm a member of a Facebook group of Lou Reed obsessives. And out of curiosity, I put on there, what do people experience when they listen to Metal Machine Muzak? And this guy said, I'm bipolar. And I put it on, and it relaxes me.
That makes sense.
That's why the liner notes are so crucial, because they reflect, Lou saying that there are 8 Lou Reeds at any one given moment. I do Lou Reed better than anyone else, etc. Metal Machine Muzak is a reflection of that fracturedness, as are the liner notes. And that's one of the things that makes it really, truly absorbing as a piece of work.
Yeah, and the deeper in you get, the more you get out of it. Now, the article that I had mentioned before, you wrote it specifically for Ugly Things?
Yeah, and what it was probably like you. I've read all of the Lou Reed biographies, and they all have something to recommend them. But my feeling is that people can't do justice to Lou's persona and influence. I'm not saying him as a man, because I don't think you ever know a biographical subject as a human being. but Lou's persona and Lou's work, because there's just so much of it. You know, they've got to do the Velvets and they've got to do Lulu and they've got to get it all in. And I kept reading people saying, oh, you know, White Light, White Heat is a reference to Alice Bailey and esoteric practices. But nobody asked the question, why? Why was Lou Reed even referencing those things? And what did he want out of it? And that was my starting point, was why was Lou so interested in the white light, in the work of Alice Bailey, in all of the strange things that he practiced, the macrobiotic diets, the energy transference? What was going on? And I started following a line of thought of Lou as a seeker after truth in a kind of sort of 60s hippie way that he would have at the time curled his lip up, at least in public, and starting to see Metal Machine Muzak in that vein more than anything else. And I interviewed a guy called Charlie Frick, who interviewed Lou for the Aquarian Times out of New Jersey in 74 or 75. I think it was probably late 75 because it was after Metal Machine Muzak came out. And so Lewis just made the punkest of punk albums, but he's talking about going down to the Alice Bailey monthly moon meditation meetings at UN Plaza. And I was thinking, well, how does the guy dressed up in leathers, the rock and roll animal, the speed freak, that guy fit with somebody who's going down and meditating once a month at a full moon meditation thing, and starting to think, well, maybe his purpose with Metal Machine Muzak was related to esoteric practices, but was also relating in a far deeper way than I'd ever written about before, his feelings about being a rock and roll star. I mean, everybody I've spoken to from that time, including Victor Bokros, his biographer who knew him, Elliot Murphy, who was a friend of his, the singer-songwriter guy, they all said that Lou loved being a rock and roll star.
I want to have some context for what you're talking about with these interviews. So before you go on with specifics, tell me about whether your article that you wrote, the Chasing the White Light article for Ugly Things, if that begat the book, how long you've been working on it, if it has a title. Tell me about the book first.
So the article concluded with Metal Machine Muzak. And it concluded with an interview with the Zeitkratzer guy who scored Metal Machine Muzak. And then I forwarded the article to Jason in Laurie Anderson's office and got involved very peripherally with Hudson River Wind meditations. And that started me thinking more and more about Metal Machine Muzak. And knowing that next year will be the 50th anniversary of Metal Machine Muzak, knowing that through my conversations with Don Fleming and Jason Stern of the Lou Reed Archive, that there were a number of us out there who were Lou Reed obsessives, but in particular Metal Machine Muzak obsessives, and feeling that it was the richest Lou Reed album could go into in real depth. And also feeling, although my article was almost 10,000 words long, it was 8,000 words long, I think, I hadn't even scratched the surface, that I wanted to write a book devoted to Metal Machine Muzak. And it started life as a pitch to Bloomsbury for their 33 1/3 series, and they limit you to 30,000 words. But to be honest, I could write considerably more because I'm meeting people like yourself. I interviewed Thurston Moore. I'm discovering the existence of projects like Metal Machine Muzak. I'm discovering how seriously Metal Machine Muzak has been taken academically.
How long have you been writing it?
Been writing it now for about 6 months.
Okay.
I've still got a long way to go.
I hope it does not turn out to be part of the 33 1/3 series. It seems like a much larger topic than just the backstory of an album. To me, this is a much larger story that deserves a much larger platform, a broader platform.
Well, I think you're right, and thank you for saying that, Dave. Discovering the existence of people like yourself and your project, discovering that a lot of what's said about Metal Machine Muzak is, in my opinion, not wrong, but slight. We know that Metal Machine Muzak is a highly constructed piece of work.
Is the record possibly just a fuck you to the record company and a fuck you to high art theorists like us who look at it and say, you know, because I'm on the fence. I don't necessarily think this was a highly considered work, nor do I think it was just a middle finger. But I think it's possibly a middle finger.
Well, isn't that the beauty of it? It's a Lou Reed album, and it fits completely within the canon, to use a pretentious word, of Lou Reed's recorded work.
All four of the guys who were participants in Metal Machine Muzak, In my follow-up interviews with them, I ask them, which is the more abrasive work? Which is the more divisive, assaultive work? Is it Metal Machine Muzak or is it Sally Can't Dance? And the answer was unanimous. It's Sally Can't Dance.
That's great. I think for Lou Reed fans, it is for sure, because it's hard to like Sally Can't Dance, isn't it? I personally love, I mean, I think Kill Your Sons is one of the best things Lou Reed's ever done, but it's got animal language on it, hasn't it? If anything's an insult to anybody, animal language is. Right. But I could read you a quote from Michael Fonfara about the making of Metal Machine Muzak, which I think perhaps helped shape or form the myth. And he says, Lou just filled the room up with Marshall amps. He put them all in series together, turned them all up to 11, put the mics on, brought his guitar in, and then just whacked it a bunch of times until it started to feedback horribly. And then we all ran out of the room and shut the door. Lou would make me go back into the room because it was so loud. He told me he had to protect his ears. Now, that's great and it's funny, but there's also an interview with Lou that you can find online, conducted for the Browbeat fanzine, where Lou talks about how he constructed it in terms of the loops. And given that we were referencing Burroughs before, and the Burroughs, as you know, he didn't just use the cut-up technique. He used the fold-in technique as well. Lou talks about folding in tracks and recording over recording over recording over recording. And you could say that's because he was speeding his tits off, in the same way that you could say that Burroughs made a lot of the cut-ups because he was on the nod, you know, and fixated on a few words. You could say all of those things. You could say that Metal Machine Muzak was Lou being really sick and tired of people like Lester Bangs and Christgau venerating the Velvets and dismissing his solo work and just wanting, as you say, to do the ultimate punk fuck you. You could say it was all of these things. You could say it was a pure love of electricity. You could say, as Will Hermes does, which I think is absolutely great, although I think hard to justify, that it was like a queer scream of rage.
Has Laurie Anderson spoken about what she believes it is?
She hasn't yet. I mean, she's talked a little bit about it, and she did in those liners for Hudson River Wind Meditations. And she said interesting things like drone was in the air at that time in the 60s. And of course, Lou was exposed to it just like everybody else was. And I think this is one of the things I've read Metal Machine Muzak described as karaoke drone, which is kind of pretty insulting. And this idea that must have, well, we know got up Lou's nose no end, that Cale was the authentic one and he was the dilettante. You know, one line of thinking is that this is a guy who had a course of electric shock treatments when he was 18. This is a guy who was working with amplifiers and amplified electric guitars from the early 50s, you know, from being a teenager in the early 50s, mid-50s, who, please, could have discovered feedback on his own, could have discovered the cut-up on his own, could have discovered the pleasure of pure noise. And that's something Laurie's talked about as noise as a refuge for musicians like her and like Lou.
Well, if I had to define Laurie, it would be as a performance artist. But Lou, it's like his life was performance art because he was kind of a sub-brill building songwriter for hire and he was a noisologist. He had every layer to him. You know, one of the great things about Metal Machine Muzak that you touched on is that it's one of the only projects of his where it seems to incorporate all the layers. Depending on which twist of the kaleidoscope you go with, that is what it is that day. There's nothing that's correct or incorrect about your notions of what it is.
Absolutely. And there's the idea that the guitars were tuned to fifths, which I'm not a guitar head and I'm not a tech head or anything like that. I don't play the guitar. But that is apparently the tuning for avant-garde tuning. You know, it's the ostrich tuning that goes right back to the track, The Ostrich, that, you know, Cale heard and was intrigued by, that Lou had made. He tuned his guitars to that tuning, whether he did it instinctively or whether he did it because he knew what he was doing. We don't know. So in one sense, Metal Machine Muzak is absolutely as rock and roll as it gets.
And The Ostrich, which is a dance craze song, or at least hoping to be, was one chord. So in a sense, it's more assaultive than Metal Machine Muzak, which is all over the place in terms of its orchestration, quote unquote. But the ostrich is, in a sense, if you strip it down, is more pummeling than that.
What's interesting is when you listen to Metal Machine Muzak seriously and you listen to all of it, as opposed to one 16.01 minute section, you realize that there's a lot of variety, isn't it? There's points where sound drops out, where noises appear and reappear. There's a noise that sounds like a cross between somebody locked in a cupboard and a helicopter approaching. And one of the things that I was wondering about was if Bob Ludwig, the guy who mastered and engineered it, is to be believed, Lou was working on it in spring 75, that was around the time of the fall of Saigon. So was Lou prompted to make that noise by watching the TV with the sound turned down and Saigon being evacuated? You know, you can have such a lot of fun with this really highly speculative stuff. And to circle back on what we were talking about before, that's why writing something like this is a lot more fun than writing a biography, because you can stop and you can speculate and you can go deeply into a line of thought.
So tell me about the first big rabbit hole that opened up for you working on the book, where you had a white light realization about something, whether personal or objective.
I can tell you it was Remember, Boom from the liner notes, and the realization that Metal Machine Muzak was constructed to do something, and that it was also, I believe you can argue, influenced by Lou's being taught about the work of Alice Bailey, who believed that we are here for a purpose and that our purpose is to serve humanity. And one of her books, believe it or not, considering where Lou was coming from, is called Glamour, a World Problem. And in this Charlie Frick interview that I referenced before, Lou talks about how he's considered applying the teaching of Alice Bailey to his music. So essentially serving humanity, the notion of Lou Reed serving humanity, or the mythological Lou Reed serving humanity through his music, kind of sounds a bit ludicrous, really. But then when you think about, I come back again and again and again to those lines from Street Hassle, you know, the spoken word bit. What does he say? I'll probably garble this, but he says, you know, there are some people that don't have a choice. They can never find a voice to call their own. So the first thing they see that allows them the right to be, they follow it. It's called bad luck.
Yep.
Those, to me, are some of the finest lines Lou Reed has ever written.
Definitely. My favorite line from that entire song, though, is "Sha-la-la-la, man."
Yeah. It's so beautifully sardonic.
Yeah. Even as a high schooler, I heard a lot more in "Sha-la-la-la, man." I mean, that felt to me like an entire life philosophy embedded in that line.
Yeah, the resignation, the destruction of dreams, the harking back to, as you say, the Brill Building, the Shangri-Las, the Shirelles, the destruction of innocence. You're right. I've never really thought of it like that. I just thought of it as a cool utterance. But you're absolutely right.
The way he says it, it speaks multitudes.
Well, then it's also Tra-la-la-la, man. And then you think of Tra-la-la in Last Exit to Brooklyn, which was one of his favorite books.
Yeah. And in fact, I just had a conversation the other day with a guy who is starting to give a walking tour around New York City. And I just took this tour 2 days ago that centers around all the spots that Lou and the Velvets swept through from 63 to 66. And, you know, all the Lamonte Young and all the spots where the early demos were recorded and the very early performances. And Waiting for the Man and Heroin were not written at the end of his dalliance with all this stuff when he was a junkie. They were written, in all likelihood, directly after the very first experience that he had with heroin. I believe, just like any kind of suburban Jew that would be fucking around with drugs, that he was really just flirting with junk to get a better literary perspective and write song lyrics like Selby would write novels.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. But one of the things that kind of intrigues me is that when you read about accounts of Lou in the 70s and Hale talking about the two of them shooting up smack together, the question is, why was he doing it then? Was he doing it just because he was such a speed freak and so used to needles? Or was he dallying again But I think you're right in that we talked earlier, didn't we, about some of us desperately want to walk on the wild side and are kind of looking for that, looking for an example, really, which someone like Lou obviously detested being accused of turning anyone on to smack or alcohol or anything like that. But some of us found in his persona a green light for those kind of indulgences, that we sailed through that green light at our cost. I think Lou was doing like Burroughs always balked at the idea that he turned anyone on to junk. But you can argue that the Burroughs persona did. And you can argue that the rock and roll animal persona did. It wasn't really Lou Reed as a human being who, as you say, is a nice middle-class Jewish boy coming in from Long Island to find things to write about, enthralled to Burroughs and Kerouac and Ginsberg and Selby himself.
Just a hunger for authenticity. And then stepping over the line like a guy that I once knew who's unfortunately passed away, who was a good friend of mine, who got so jaded by the lifestyle of drug taking that he actually considered the prospect of killing somebody just to feel something.
Wow.
And this was a good guy when I knew him. I didn't know him in his using days, but you become so desensitized. I've never used the needle, but I've certainly gotten to a place where I felt so numbed by my own thirst for dissociation. At first it's a hunger for authenticity and experience, and then it's just the desperate need for desensitization that you need to create something like Metal Machine Muzak to wake yourself up again.
I think that's very interesting, the notion that you're doing it to feel, to create. And that leads into, doesn't it, the question of why is it called Metal Machine Muzak? Why those three words? What do those three words mean? The superficial level, I thought, well, maybe Lou was the machine. Lou was the metal machine. As you say, thoroughly desensitized. And he played with desensitization, didn't he? With kicks is the thing that springs to mind, with some of the more deadpan aspects of Street Hassle. And there was this notion that certainly appealed to me when I was a young man, from Berlin, I don't care. This idea that you could believe that Lou Reed didn't care because young men feel things so intensely. The notion of not wanting to care is hugely romantic. And it's like the idea of Burroughs as somebody who got away with shooting his wife and didn't suffer, which is thoroughly and utterly untrue. These were, highly emotional men who were numbing themselves because life was too painful. And when you read accounts of Lou Reed in later life, bursting into tears when he heard certain pieces of music, pointing to the hair standing up on end on his arm and being so moved by music that you can understand that that was so painful that he would want to numb himself. Burroughs' painful self-consciousness. You see photographs of Burroughs as a boy and as a young man. He just looks like he doesn't want to be on Earth. And then you think about him and Brian Geisen and their notion of here to go, that we're just passing through this life and trying to get out as fast as we possibly can to go somewhere else. Life was never that painful for me. I was a good middle-class boy who used mainly alcohol to walk on the wild side because that was, in one sense, the easiest way to do it. And it had that literary tradition that made it seem not just authentic, but somehow cool. And that was fine till it turned around and bit me in the ass, But I can tell you that reading those Lester Bangs things that describe Lou as half cut and him saying, I've got to have the strong liquor or I don't feel anything at all. And I was 13 or 14 years old, feeling very painfully self-conscious, feeling like an alien myself. It contributed to my idea that I was going to do that.
For me, it was actually, oddly, it was more Lester Bangs than it was Lou. I remember, I believe it was an article about White Light, White Heat and Astral Weeks, and something about him coming off of a bender and all the feels descending on him at once. And I had never, I don't think at that point, done any drugs. I was more of a drug taker than a drinker, but having a great curiosity about what he was talking about in that and coming to know all too well what the fuck he was talking about at a certain point.
Right. Yeah. You see, I was never much of a drug taker. I wasn't very good at drugs and they didn't really appeal to me very much. I liked all of the romance that went with alcohol, and I went too far into it like you do. Really. And I should never have started in the beginning. I was one of those people that should never, ever, ever have started, but I did. And I'm extremely grateful that I stopped when I did. And it's done for me. And I think that, I can only speculate But, you know, Lou was an addict, wasn't he, for whatever reasons?
Is there anyone that can step into the orbit of Metal Machine Muzak, kind of like the orbit of the Rolling Stones, who has not had a dalliance with substances?
That's a very good point. Although my fiance, who certainly hasn't, admired Metal Machine Muzak no end. I don't think she wants to listen to it ever again, but I would say she got it.
Wait until you're married and then ask her how she feels about
it. I don't think I'll ever play it other than on earphones, Dave.
She appreciates it from a distance and loves probably the inspiration it teases out in you.
Those of us who came to Metal Machine Muzak because of Sally Can't Dance, because of Rock and Roll Heart, because much as I love Coney Island Baby, because of Coney Island Baby.
Because of My New Joystick.
Yeah, although I like Bits of New Sensations, although I think Doing the Things That We Want To is one of the most appalling lyrics Lou Reed ever wrote.
New Sensations could be the theme song for Metal Machine Muzak, though.
Well, they are. Yeah, they are new sensations, aren't they?
At first, if your ears are not attuned to an experience like that, if you're not one for the avant-garde typically, and you somehow wind up leaving it on, it'll open up these rooms in your mind that drugs tend to open up, or meditation, or certain modes of eating, any kind of seeker type pursuit. And you'll get to know parts of yourself that had heretofore lain dormant. And some people don't want to know those parts of themselves, which is understandable. I'm just curious, by the way, does your book have a title yet?
I was playing with the idea of magic in a garbage pail.
That's great.
Yeah, well, you know the reference, of course. It's from Dirty Boulevard off the New York album. The little boy has found a book on magic in a garbage pail.
That's fantastic. I'm guessing there will be a colon and a reference to Metal Machine Muzak after that, but that is an incredible title.
Well, thanks very much. I kind of like it, but yeah, it would have to have that obligatory colon that references Metal Machine Muzak. But it's interesting how I saw Metal Machine Muzak initially as a challenge. Could I listen beyond 30 or 40 seconds? Like meditation, where you sit down and you try and calm your mind and you try and watch your breath. And it just doesn't work. But the longer you sit, the better you get at it. And you have longer periods of time where you are following your breath. And I took Metal Machine Muzak partly as a way into an altered state, but also in the way that I use a flicker device called a mind machine. It uses binaural beats. And you get a pair of glasses attached to a unit that generates flicker in different patterns. And it works on your brain waves, your alpha waves through to your theta waves. And that's initially scary. The first 10 seconds of hearing binaural beats through headphones, having these glasses where bright lights are flickering at you, you want to take it off instantly. But if you stick with it, you go into very deep altered states. And that informed the way that I use Metal Machine Muzak, which is to go into an altered state. Do you think it's a piece of music or do you think it's a piece of noise?
It's both. You know, the fact that it's been transcribed is proof that it is music. And the fact that most people will very quickly reach for the stop button the second it goes on is proof of the other. What do you think is the legacy of Metal Machine Muzak? I mean, because most people have heard of it and have not heard it. What is the broad overall legacy of Metal Machine Muzak?
I interviewed Thurston Moore for the book, who's on record talking about the influence of Metal Machine Muzak on him and the people he was hanging around with in the New York noise scene in the late 70s, which is only 4 years after Metal Machine Muzak came out. I've spoken to Don Fleming, who was a teenage Metal Machine Muzak fan. I think that it's had an influence certainly on noise music. I think it also gave a certain kind of permission in terms of punk and in terms of post-punk and what could be done. Although what's interesting is when you look at the post-punk people that you could argue that maybe Metal Machine Muzak influenced, they were doing that sort of stuff often before Lou, like, for example, Throbbing Gristle, which I'm sure Genesis Porridge was a massive fan of Metal Machine Muzak or admired it. But Throbbing Gristle were making very discordant music before Metal Machine Muzak ever came out. So I think it had a kind of permission. I think there are a lot of musicians that admire it and use it, like I say, as an opportunity to just go as far as they want to go. One of the great things I was told by Stuart Herwood that Paul Weller loves Metal Machine Muzak. And you cannot think of anybody less likely to like Metal Machine Muzak than Paul Weller.
Well, Taylor Swift.
Maybe she uses it to psych herself up before she goes and sings to God knows how many billion people.
Right.
You know, but I think it gave people permission. And it sort of set a target, really. I can't think of a mainstream rock and roll act who have confronted their fans in such a way. I don't think Neil Young has ever done it. I don't think Bob Dylan has ever done it. Bowie never did it. They played safe by comparison. Lou Reed.
Self-Portrait by Bob Dylan, to me almost equals it, but in a different way. It's kind of the flip side. They thought he was revolutionary, so he tried to go so middle of the road that he disappeared up his own ass. And to me, that's just as fascinating in a flip side kind of way. People going through his garbage, looking for clues, and he was just sick of it. So he was doing purposely bad covers of artists that he had inspired so that people would just leave him the fuck alone and he could live in the country.
But then, you've got Lou apologizing for putting out Metal Machine Muzak afterwards, haven't you? I was reading something in the British Melody Maker from that time the other day of Lou apologizing for Metal Machine Muzak. And if anybody hated it, now he could have had his tongue firmly in his cheek, of course. But then you've got Lou, the very canny operator who liked being a rock and roll star, who wanted to be an even bigger rock and roll star and was pissed off that, say, Bowie kept stealing his thunder. And you've got Lou that had a massive legal fight with his manager at the same time that Metal Machine Muzak was going on, who needed money. Okay, he was getting out of his contract with RCA, but he still needed to make records. I mean, it's all he ever wanted to do. He wasn't going to go back to his father's accountancy firm in Long Island again, was he? I don't know whether Coney Island Baby is as much of a volte-face from Metal Machine Muzak as it appears. There's a great bootleg tape of Lou playing in Holland in 1977, and he plays Charlie's Girl from Coney Island Baby, and it lasts 19 minutes because it segues into Metal Machine Muzak.
That's great.
So you've got Lou the operator and Lou the purist.
Let's not forget that Kicks is on Coney Island Baby and Murder Mysteries on the Third Velvet Underground record, so it's never as clear-cut as seems on the surface.
Well, yeah, exactly. And even what could have been an exercise in just joining the dots, like Rock and Roll Heart, was touted at the time as being jazzy. It's not ever as clear-cut, I don't think. And I think that's why you can see Metal Machine Muzak very much as, first and foremost, a Lou Reed album.
The ultimate Lou Reed album, it's, as I think of it, it's like the color white. It has all music embedded in it.
And Lou said a variant of that. He said, I deliberately embedded a few notes from Beethoven's Fifth or whatever it might be. And if you listen closely, you hear them whizzing past. It's a great line. I'm not sure. I don't believe it's true.
For my own thoughts on this, here's how I'd like to conclude is I'm one of the less likely candidates to have ever joined a fraternity in college, but I did. And it was a hazing fraternity because I was looking for a certain kind of experience at that time. But the initiation process was 30 hours in a basement, blindfolded, without water or food, and being played a 10-second loop tape of all the brothers in the fraternity going, ah, like that. And we were told at the beginning that there was a hidden message in there and that we weren't getting out of the basement until we discovered what the message was. There were 4 of us in that basement. And we were all very studious at really trying to get to the bottom of what was that message. And I heard the seagulls, just like you said before. I heard the seagulls. So when you said that, it was the first thing that I thought of was, almost like the seagull sounding noises in the Beatles' Tomorrow Never Knows. It's that high, I think the high frequencies tease out those sonic seagulls. But, that loop tape is not something that I would ever want to have on a mix CD for myself. Those 10 seconds I never want to hear again, but I'm not apt to forget it anytime soon. And it unlocked parts of my mind that, again, I'm glad are shut back up into the vault, but I'm not about to forget that loop tape and know there was no embedded message.
Those fucking seagulls, Dave.
Yeah.
We always knew they were sinister. We always knew they were harbingers of doom. There's your answer. That's a terrific story, though. I love that story. the US Army would play Metallica, wouldn't it, in the Gulf? And didn't they play somebody horrific at President Marcos or somebody or other, the CIA? Presumably there are instances that we don't know anything about where the CIA has played Metal Machine music at people who've instantly crumbled and run screaming out of buildings, holding their ears, screaming, "The seagulls, the seagulls."
I could see you, once you release this book, being pulled into the CIA as an operative. I'm really unbelievably looking forward to this book, and I hope that because the possible perspectives on this thing are so huge and so limitless, that I hope that you utilize it as a boundless platform for your own seeking and for others seeking as well, instead of just a straight scholarly approach and a straight objective telling of the events that led up to it. Because this truly is a Rorschach test. And if Magic in a Garbage Pail reaches its true potential, it can have an actual brain rearranging effect, just like the source material.
Well, thank you very much, Dave. Thanks a lot. I mean, I have toyed about with the idea of having 4 sections that are sort of 16.01 something or other long. I think we know so much about the context that subjectivity and the intersection between literature, culture, music, and esoteric practices is, I think, where Lou would happily be. He was confounding, but he was deadly serious.
I hope your book stands on all those different turfs simultaneously. I can't wait to read it. For whatever reason, the name of the film escapes me right now, but there's that 1950s sci-fi horror film. The creatures are brains with spines dangling from them, and they insert themselves into people's bodies and take over their consciousness. And that is Metal Machine Muzak.
Isn't it one of the Star Trek movies where the aliens speak in Metal Machine Muzak?
I believe the episode's called The Sonic Seagulls.
Yeah, exactly. Those fucking seagulls.
All right, that about does it. Stay tuned, because next Friday brings upon us my conversation with the Lemon Twigs about Brian Wilson's underrated post-Smile come-down period. That's right, it's a celebration of Wild Honey and Friends. A heartfelt Discograffiti thanks goes out to my beautiful wife and son, Jen and Mason, the spot-on David Holzer, Michael Dutcher, Rudy Fishman, Becky Boyd, my incredibly loyal fans, and especially the entire Patreon community, the Soldiers of Sound. I love every last one of you, and this show would not exist without you, my friends. Speaking of friends, it's high time for some new ones. They're in our Facebook group, Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound. That's the best way to find out what's coming up on the show, but there's a hell of a lot more. You get recaps of the day in music history, the ability to pitch questions to guests, polls that put you in the driver's seat on guest and band decisions, and access to a thriving creative hub if you're looking for a collaborator. So make sure you don't miss out. You can find the link to the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound Facebook page right there in the show notes. And if you don't mess with the Zuck, no sweat. Just email me at info@discograffiti.com and I'll keep you in the loop. So now that it's done and you want more, another way to dive even deeper into the 4 visionaries featured on the upcoming Metal Machine Muzak tribute album is to leap headfirst into Lou Barlow Rates the Zombies. That's episodes 59 and 60. Unquestionably the greatest Lou Barlow interview of all time. That's episode 62. Juan's CORY HANSON rating his band's entire discography plus his solo work. That's episodes 120 and 121. And don't miss his Patreon companion episodes. CULLEN HART rating the Olivia Tremor Control and the circulatory system. That's episodes 131, 132, and 133. With substantially elongated edits in our Patreon for the Lieutenant and Major tiers, and the epic 16-hour Mark Robinson interview, which is episodes 128, 130, 135, and 136, with massively elongated companion edits on our Lieutenant and Major tiers in our Patreon as well. And of course, be sure to mark your calendars, because next Friday, May 17th, we're coming at you with the Lemon Twigs. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss a single second of it. And so, from now till then, don't let our youth go to waste, lads and ladies. It's Discograffiti!
Osiris.